Hello and welcome to Free Friday Frights. This is Mark Leslie. Today is Friday, May 18th, 2011, and today I will be reading from the story Browsers, which is about a bookstore that's a little bit like a Venus flytrap. So book nerds like me, beware. Let's start with the story. Browsers. And the story opens with a quote. The stimulation of seeing so many books so suddenly seemed almost more than was good for the frail little boy. George R. Stewart, Earth Abides. Stepping into a used bookshop is sometimes like stepping into another dimension. Where else but a used bookstore can one find such an eclectic selection of minds and experiences stored in dusty tomes, just waiting to be browsed through by anyone who happens along? Occasionally, a used bookshop can be a painful experience, offering up nothing more than the latest trashy paperbacks and adult porn magazines. But sometimes a used bookstore can provide to the avid browser a mystical experience. Sometimes walking through that door, you're overwhelmed with a sense of awe, a sense that something powerful is being housed within the very walls. I discovered such a wondrous shop years ago on the corner of two streets whose names I cannot remember in one of those pseudo-cities on the southwestern edge of the Golden Horseshoe. Standing on the street, the sounds of traffic all around me, I beheld the quaint corner shop with curious eyes. The dark and dusty windows did not allow me a clear view of the interior of the shop. And apart from the word browsers painted on the window, there was no exterior sign to indicate the name of the establishment. Trying to remember if I'd been to this particular shop before, I opened the door. The tiny bell overhead tinkled as I stepped inside. I had to pause as the familiar feeling of awe overtook me. Perhaps you feel it too when you walk into a used bookshop. The feeling that all eternity is poised, trapped in the moment, just waiting to spill forth into the future. Literature has always fascinated me. With writing, humankind has developed the ability to elevate a person to a state of immortality. And with that, anyone who reads can thus share in that immortal bliss. None of us have ever had the pleasure of meeting Shakespeare or Dickens personally, but they're still companions in our day-to-day travels. Though long dead, they're very much with us. That is the beauty and the power of literature. Perhaps that's why I've spent the last 3 decades of my life writing, trying to capture the spirit of myself on paper. To that point, I'd been unsuccessful, forced to live vicariously through the bold efforts of those great masters who'd come before me. It's probably why I would take such pleasure in browsing through a used bookshop. And occasionally, when feeling daring, I would fantasize about future generations browsing such a shop and finding one of my works, essentially discovering my spirit and thus keeping me alive. The absence of a book clerk was the first thing I noticed in the store. But that wasn't unusual. He or she could be shelving books or helping another customer. Standing in the tiny entranceway, I glanced at the small podium desk, which I assumed the owner used as a workspace. My eyes then led forward to the next connected room, which was perhaps 8 by 12 feet. I moved into it. This room, crammed with the usual variety of books, led off directly to another room of similar size. Trying to get my bearings, I searched through the second room to find 2 more doorways to a third and fourth room. I took the door on the right and found from that room another 3 choices. The peculiarity struck me at that point. I paused and breathed in my amazement. What looked like such a tiny corner shop was actually a huge space divided into a multitude of rooms. I saw myself spending a lot of time here. I decided to waste no more time and began my browsing. I turned and scanned the books that filled the room I stood in. The shelves reached all the way up to the 9-foot ceiling of the room and were packed tightly with all sorts of books. Scanning the titles, I noticed that there's no particular order to them. There was an abundance of westerns and the occasional thriller shelved in this room, but apart from that, there was a plethora of every other imaginable type of book, from a selection of children's picture books to a sampling of cheap dime paperbacks. This room had it all. On the far wall sat a selection of magazines and comic books. Beside that were stacks of yellowed newspapers. What an interesting setup, I muttered, and my voice carried strangely through the room. My words broke a silence so thick I might have been standing in an ancient Egyptian tomb. I turned as if trying to catch my words and take them back so that I might not wake the sleeping texts. But alas, my words were out and lost to me forever. As I turned, I looked through the entrance to another room I hadn't seen before, and a paperback book spine leapt out at me as if highlighted. I stepped into that room and I plucked the book from the shelf. It was one of my favorites from a long time back. George R. Stewart's Earth Abides. I held it in my hand like a trophy. I thumbed it open and sniffed at the wonderfully musty smell that can hardly be described so much as it is loved by a bibliophile. Then I flipped through to the middle of the book and began reading, but not aloud. I dared not speak anything else aloud for the fear of ruining again that special silence. I read a passage that had stuck with me all these years. The main character, Ish, upon rebuilding a small civilization after the world has been ravaged by plague, takes the boy, Joey, to one of the libraries left over from before year one. Halfway through this scene, I noticed that certain words from the passage were missing, as if the ink from the page had dissolved. I flipped through to another passage. Sure enough, the same thing seemed to have happened there as well. I put the book down and picked up another one. Again, several passages throughout that text were blank. In some places, complete lines were missing. I tried another to find the same results randomly scattered throughout the book. I paused and I sniffed the air, as if I would be able to tell if there were some sort of corrosive elements lurking in the room, slowly removing the ink from the pages, but I could detect nothing. Instead, I left the books there and moved on to the next room to my right. I selected another paperback and noticed that none of the words were missing from it. I replaced it and I moved across the room, grabbing at what appeared to be an old sociology text. Strangely, whole pages and entire chapters of this book were blank. I'd heard stories and read articles stating that the paper itself on some of the oldest books printed were apparently reacting with the atmosphere, reacting with the air, causing the ink in the paper to disintegrate. I wondered if perhaps a similar thing was happening here, but just to the ink and not to the paper. Such a thought sent shivers through my being. The books in these rooms were not ancient by any means, and already the words were dissolving to nothing. A discovery like this might seem happenstance to the average person, or perhaps boring to one whose only source of information is the internet. But to a book lover like myself, it was as if God had stepped down from heaven and announced that the world would soon be ending. I spent the next 10 minutes or so rushing from room to room, picking up different types of books and thumbing through them, trying to discover if there was some sort of pattern. But the dissolution of the words seemed completely random. It wasn't specific to any one room or any one kind of book. The phenomenon appeared without any detectable pattern. Then came upon me to try to find the book clerk and point my discovery out to him or her. Or perhaps the book clerk would already have known about the strange occurrence. Perhaps they would explain that it was the result of some nearby industrial smelters filling the local atmosphere with a highly selective airborne corrosive material. Only by that point, I couldn't quite remember the way I'd come. I began a path from room to room, hoping I'd recall having been in one of them, but But in the same way that I was unable to detect a pattern in the phenomena I was discovered in the dissolving words, I was unable to recognize any of the rooms I'd passed through. I called out once, only to hear my voice echo through the room I was in and bounce out in the many available directions. But as before when I spoke, I had a strange sensation that my voice would wake the sleeping tomes. Beginning to panic, I ran. From room to room I ran, first taking every exit to my immediate right, and when that didn't help, every doorway to my left. Finally, I collapsed to the floor, out of breath and out of energy to be panicked any longer. Looks like I might be trapped here for a long time, I told myself. Might as well take my time and map out my movements so in the maze of books and rooms. Perhaps that would help me. I pulled a hardback text from the wall and flipped through it until I found a blank page. Digging into my breast pocket of my jacket, I plucked out my Mont Blanc pen, the one I always carried with me. Perhaps it was in case I was overcome with that once-in-a-lifetime inspiration that all aspiring writers dream will come. Perhaps it was a ritual of connecting myself with a writing instrument so that we were mates on this voyage of life. Whatever it was, I was glad to have made the effort my whole adult life to carry this pen with me. For that day, it just might be the thing that helped me get out of this unusual dilemma. I began to scribble down the shape of the room that I was standing in, leaving spaces to the front of myself, to my left, and directly behind me where the other rooms joined in. Then, my sketch of that room complete, I entered the room directly in front of me. A hollow groan boomed through the infinite silence. The groan steadily became a wail as I paused in the doorway, dropping both pen and book to clamp my hands to my ears. It echoed through my head despite my efforts to keep it out and seemed to swirl around the room, announcing its misery in no uncertain terms. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I turned on the spot, almost afraid to see what had caused that horrid sound. But there was nothing in the room behind me. Nothing, of course, but the books and the shelves that had always been there. There was no way I was going to go back into that room. Whatever caused that sound might be lurking around the corner. I considered my pen and the book I dropped just inside the doorway of the room and decided to abandon my plans of mapping out the place. I then wandered, almost casually, considering how startled I'd been, from room to room. Occasionally, I would stop to examine a book which caught my eye. I did this, according to my wristwatch, for about 3 hours. During this time, I discovered a couple more abnormalities. The first notable one was that a good deal of the books I examined lacked a copyright page. I wasn't sure whether to chalk that up to the same phenomenon that caused the ink to disappear or if it was for some other reason. The second was that the physical layout of the rooms. I mentioned earlier that the shelves reached all the way up to the ceiling of that first room, but I believe I failed to note the differing heights of each room I'd been in. Each room conformed to a slightly different shape and height, almost the way that each snowflake is not exactly the same as the next, no matter how similar they at first appear. It was towards the end of this casual wandering when I was struck with a strange notion. I thought about all the books I'd seen that day, which I would love to have purchased. The only problem was that I couldn't find the cashier. How ironic to have such a wonderful choice of books and be unable to purchase any. Not only that, but for the most part to discover upon beginning to take the time to read the books that it was not actually complete, that there were missing words, lines, missing complete pages. I wondered for a moment if I had died and was somehow in a kind of hell for book browsers, the ones who waltz into a store, browse for hours, even sit and read entire chapters, and then leave, never once making a single purchase. I laughed at the irony of such a hell and then decided against it. Having worked at a bookstore for my first 4 years after graduating from college, I knew that if this were such a hell, not only would I not be alone here, but there would be barely enough room for all of us, no matter how endless those rooms seemed. Still, it was an interesting premise to toss about in my mind while I tried to find my way out. Several such notions gnawed at me in the hours I wandered before I was finally overcome with fatigue and had to sit. Not long after propping myself up against the bookshelf, I must have fallen asleep. I'm not sure how long after that I woke, but when I did, it felt like no other waking I'd ever experienced. I could still sense the world around me, but I wasn't quite myself anymore. As best I can describe, I was nothing more than a room stacked with shelf upon shelf of all the books I had read in my life. I'd been added on to the maze of rooms in this bookshop and must have somehow been fused into it while I slept. I can't really say how this happened or who caused it. Perhaps this is part of a natural evolution which might have started with a single book that gained consciousness. And with human-like consciousness came the fear of disintegration and the desire to multiply and grow. Well, at least now I understand a little of the weird phenomenon which I had discovered, for it occurs in the books which I house inside of me, inside of the special room which is me. I hold inside of me all of the texts which I have read over the course of my life, and within those texts are certain words, passages, and yes, entire pages, which I either skipped over or which I accidentally missed while reading them. So it wasn't due to some strange chemical in the air, but from a reading habit which can occur in even the most fastidious reader. My consciousness is mostly taken up by the books within my spirit, and being stuck with only them, I'm sad I had not read them more carefully when I'd had the chance. For I have perused them again countless times, and yes, I'm disappointed for having accidentally or intentionally skipped certain parts, for I never will know the words I had missed out on. As time passes, though, and I'm not sure how much has, I'm slowly learning how to extend my consciousness out into the neighboring rooms and peruse any of the same texts that my silent companions have read that I might also house, hoping to fill in the gaps of my own books. It takes what seems like eternity and quite a bit of concentrated effort, but it can be done. After all, it's not like I don't have the time. But I'm leery of a time when that too will not be enough. What we need is more. We need more things to read and share with each other. And we wait for the day when one will join us who has read all the same books we have, but who has also read all the words, so we might be enlightened completely. We have nothing but time, so we wait. Oh, but soft. I think I hear the entrance bell tinkling. Could it be? Yes, yes, it is. After all this time of browsing through countless bookstores, you have found your rightful resting place. Nice of you to come. Browse to your heart's content. We have been waiting a long time for you to join us. So that, my friends, is Browsers, which is a story I had written on my first trip to Hamilton, actually. My wife at the time, we lived in Ottawa and we were visiting Hamilton. This was in the early to mid-90s. And she had wanted to go on this day-long shopping extravaganza with her mom, and me not being much for shopping when it's not books or beer, I decided to take out the yellow pages and the phone book because I was new to Hamilton. It was one of my first visits there. And I took out a map of Hamilton because you got to remember this is kind of like before the internet was really popular and it was easy to find things online. And I made a note of every single bookstore that I could in the city. And so I made a map and I spent the entire day, just had a blast, because that's the kind of thing I love to do when I'm in a new city is I believe that one of the best ways to explore and enjoy a city is to enjoy its libraries and its bookstores, and of course, in the evening enjoy its breweries and local bars. But what a great way to experience the city. And I had actually found a shop very much like this one. Now, it wasn't called Browsers. I think, if anything, on the window it said books, because there's some sort of indication to me that it was a bookstore, because I don't just wander into random buildings. And it was somewhere in the downtown Hamilton area. And because I hadn't been familiar with the city, I think it might have been Main Street or off King Street or one of the main thoroughfares through the downtown core. But I honestly can't remember where it was. Just I have sort of this vague memory of it. And I went into the store, and there was no book clerk. And there were some rooms that were under construction. Some of them were half filled with books. Some of them were empty. And it was just a mishmash. And again, room after room, and you would take steps up in the one room, and it was just, it was amazing. And I saw myself spending a lot of time there. And then I actually, there were so many conjoined rooms and connected rooms that it felt like it was like this magical Doctor Who kind of place where it looks small, but then you go in there and it's sort of infinite inside. And I went in, I was lost. I panicked for a minute, wondering if I could actually find my way out. And then I thought, oh my God, maybe this is like a Twilight Zone bookstore, and that's it for me. And I've gone to book browser hell. And so shortly after that experience, I wrote about this, and I tried to imagine, well, why would a bookstore act like a Venus flytrap? What would it want? Why would it want to do this? And I thought, well, it's because of the reading habits of the average person. They usually skip words and stuff like that. And so I thought, that's what it needs. It needs to bring more life in. It needs to bring in more literature. And of course, the panic and the hell and the torture for a book nerd like me to imagine, I mean, even being in a bookstore where you can't actually leave with the books, like that's part of the magic and the joy is taking the books home and reading them. So that had been published in a magazine called Challenging Destiny. But I thought I had it here. Challenging Destiny was a Canadian sort of a journal-sized magazine. And this one came out in January 1999, and it has the most beautiful illustrations by Janet Chu. And one of the things I think I love the best is in the one illustration, I don't name the narrator. The narrator you don't see is a male or female, and I love the fact that here's the narrator walking into the shop, and then later, yeah, it could be a female, but it could be male. Again, another beautiful illustration, and I quite love that about it. I reprinted it in the self-published collection, One Hand Screaming. It was the lead story because it was my absolute favorite story at the time. And then I reprinted it in Active Reader, and I spoke about Active Reader a few weeks ago because I read Distractions from this collection. Distractions, no, I didn't read Distractions. I read Active Reader, the title story. Distractions, the other of the three stories, which is about writer's block. So the first story in the collection was Active Reader, which is about loyalty discount cards and what might happen if a serial killer gets their hands on your identity and comes and kills you for reading certain books. Browsers, of course, which is the Venus flytrap of bookstores, and Distractions. And again, that was an experimental. This is actually a bad cut from the espresso book machine. It was one of my experiments where it didn't trim properly, so there's still some white space. And I still have lots of those off-cut copies because it's kind of neat to have those. So that was Browsers. Through Findaway Voices, which is an audiobook company, this last summer, I had an audiobook made of Active Reader. And the narrator for this book was absolutely amazing. He does a far better job than I ever could stumble through, which I just did, and absolutely brilliant. I've listened to it a couple times just because I love the sound of his voice, and I have already commissioned him. I think the next one, which is a 10,000-word story called The Murder of Scarecrows, which is about these scarecrows who take over a town in the middle of the night on the east coast of Canada. That should be out soon, and I'm pretty excited to to have that other audiobook available. But again, nothing like bookstore places, nothing like writing quiet horror about a bookstore. And I've actually written a few other bookshop stories. So good friend Carol Weeks and Michael Kelly and I were all horror writers from Carol's closer to Ottawa, and Michael's close to Toronto, like myself, and we had written a story called Relic, and we had done it as a special limited to like a digital, like just a little chapbook, and it was only ever done 100 copies, kind of photocopied together and stapled, because that was the technology at the time when we did it, and it was about this relic book that has a consciousness and is in Back of Phoenix, which is a great science fiction bookstore in Toronto, and we wrote it set at Back of Phoenix because we thought it would be cute because we were going there to do a joint author event, and we thought, well, let's do a unique short story. And we haven't ever done anything with it, so I need to reach out to Carol and Michael to see if there's something that they're interested in doing. If anyone has any questions, feel free to pop in. Thank you. Julie commented saying, it started off pleasant. I have a feeling it's all going to go so wrong. Yeah, I guess it did go wrong. It went wrong for book nerds like us, didn't it? That was kind of fun. So yeah, and it wasn't too scary. Thanks, Julie. No, again, I say I write horror, and there are some things that I write that are pretty disturbing and horrible and terrible and just nasty, and nobody should ever read because they're just too dark and disturbing. But this story in particular was more of that Twilight Zone-ish quiet horror, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with some of the old Twilight Zone episodes, and I marveled at one of the episodes, which was, I think it was called World Enough and Time or something like that. And it was about a book nerd who just wanted time. All he wanted to do was time to read, which is a thing that I struggle with all the time. I just want more time to read. So the world ends, and he is delighted because there he is at the New York Public Library. He has access to gigantic selection of books. And of course, as he's gathering up the books, he's got these big, thick pop bottle glasses. And as he's gathering them up, of course, the world has ended. So there's no way to get new glasses. He drops his glasses, they shatter, he can't see anything, therefore he can't read. And that's that horrifying experience. Like the average person goes, yeah, the nerd dropped his glasses, but somebody like me sees that and goes, oh my God, the poor guy, his life is over. And I should mention, I referred to, in this story, I referred to Earth Abides by George R. Stewart, which is a classic, like 1950s science fiction film about the end of the world. And I discovered it when I was young, and I rediscovered it when I got a little bit older, and I've read it multiple times. It's a wonderful book. And there is that passage, which I quote at the beginning, and that's where the boy Joey has never seen a library before, and he's overwhelmed with the number of books. And that was such a powerful scene to me, and I thought that would be perfect for that. And the other things I should let you know, and I kind of noticed this only when I read the story years later, is I had planted a heck of a lot of foreshadowing in the story because I talk about him saying, I could see myself spending a lot of time here, and talk about the spirit of people in books, because that's what the rooms are, and that it's almost like there's sleeping text, that it's actually, the bookstore was a living, breathing thing. So I did purposely plant a lot of foreshadowing into what was going to happen, and that was probably done not in the first draft, but it was probably done in one of the rewrites. And of course, one of the rewrites was with David was the editor. David Garnett was the editor, I think. David Switzer, sorry, was the editor of Challenging Destiny, which is a magazine that was published here in Ontario, and just a beautiful little digest-sized thing. So I want to thank you guys for joining me, for listening to the Free Friday Frights. I hope you had fun with browsers. I hope this does not put you off from going into used bookstores or bookstores in general, because don't worry, I've been to thousands of them, and this hasn't happened to me yet. So I'm pretty sure you're probably going to be safe. It is a long weekend here in Canada, Victoria Day weekend. I know the royal wedding is taking place. We celebrate the Queen's birthday here in the Commonwealth Canada on Monday. So it is a long weekend, and it is also the unofficial launch of summer for us here, and we are delighted to have that. So wherever you are, I hope you have a great long weekend, or just a great weekend in general. Thanks for joining me for the Free Friday Frights, and have a fantastic weekend.